Welcome back to E-Pathshala, EPG program in Japanese. I am taking your paper on communication through translation, and we are into the second module, which again is translation traditions. Module ID is JPN_P05_M02. Well, I am same Ashok Chawla, Chief Scientist and Head Translation Division, CSIR NISCARE New Delhi, visiting professor at APU Japan and visiting faculty at JNU New Delhi. Let's revise what we did in the previous module, that is the translation tradition part 1. Learning about the history and traditions related to the domain of translation is very important. It was translation that helped cross-culture communication, which in turn led to the exchange of human beings, cultures, customs, practices, techniques and technology. Though mostly it began with translation of religious texts, well, you can see it in Buddhist scriptures, or it could be Christianity related texts, but gradually it moved from there into related areas and then ultimately into science, and then it spread from the missionaries or from the monasteries to common people and from common people to institutions. In the process, state-sponsored activities usually had a certain design, may it be the import of technology or knowledge, trade or war compulsions, or religion for the peace and harmony. As I promised in the previous module, we will be taking up French, Russian and Indian traditions in this module. Let's start with the French traditions. French, you all are aware, you have fashion in your mind, you have got trends in your mind. Let's see what was the role of translation. Initially, translation was carried out from French to Latin, wherein documents were translated from French and the place was monasteries usually. 13th century gave boost to French translation. Renaissance led to the decline of great Latin tradition as King Charles V encouraged translation into French. Dole introduced the term. As we move forward, we see Dole introducing the equivalent terms for the concepts like translate and translator in French, and he is also given the credit for creating what is called probably the first translation theory. When we put it in English, it comes as the way of translating from one language to the other. The print technology of the 16th century led to the development of translation of the classics. The 17th and 18th century saw the advent of what is called in English the unfaithful beauties, where the motive was to produce translations which appeared pleasant to the readers. So you can see the trend changing here. In the 18th century, French translation lost popularity due to German and English Gothic novels. English translation became popular, and adaptation was seen as a means of adjusting foreign works to suit contemporary taste, and grammar was stressed upon. The Romantic era made translating a literary activity where literalism was in fashion and parallel translation in verse and prose evolved. The France or the French things enjoy here in India or even otherwise, translation also showed almost same glimpses. Let's go now to Russian traditions. There has to be a remarkable difference between the two. French was in a way complete democracy. On the other hand, Russia was a controlled system or controlled mechanism for a few decades at least. Russian language, it comes under the East Slavonic family of languages. Russia adopted Christianity in 988 AD, and the translation of New Testament, the Psalter and the Prayer Book, these were among the first translations. You can see here also it started with religious texts, and there will be gradual change you will see through the Russian tradition. Mikhail, who was also a well-known learned person, a writer, an educator, a philosopher, he worked on the art of translation, which is the first recorded exposition on the subject in Russia. He emphasized on the careful analysis of the source text and extensive knowledge of language. Now see carefully here, it is the art, that means the translation is an art. This concept is taking shape here. There is a term used, source text, and there is a term used, knowledge of language. Let's see further. During this period, there were 4 categories of translators. These were staff translators, what are normally known as official translators in today's world. Then monks. Monks means young priests who are under training. While undergoing the training, they undertake the work of translation also. Then part-time translators, free translators, or what are called freelance translators, and different fields targeted for the translation included astrology, astronomy, arithmetic, geometry, anatomy, medicine. See the remarkable difference here, the change here. There is no concept like one single translator. It's categorized. Staff translators, obviously it means they are responsible for translating the documents which will fall mostly in the category of classified documents. Then monks, who would be responsible for translating or bringing in the literature related to religion, philosophy, maybe the social systems, etc. And the part-time translators, who would be doing translation for either of these streams but on part-time basis. And then there are freelance translators, which means they get a particular job, they concentrate on that job, then they go for another job, concentrate on that job, and the areas covered were as wide as astronomy to medicine. The first academy was set up, whose language school graduates usually became official translators. This period also saw the emergence of poetry translation in Russia. So again, there is a difference here. The poems or the verses, they were happening, the translations were happening in the French traditions also. This is repeated here in the Russian tradition also. A new trend is seen in Russian tradition at this stage. There were authors who were struggling to write certain works and get them published, and translators were supposed to translate those works. What does a translator do? He basically comprehend the original text. You know, in the previous slides was the source text, and the analysis of the language was emphasized upon. So translator tries to bring out a product which is more comprehensible, which is in quality terms better, and sometimes it surpasses the source text in terms of artistic quality. As a result, the translators were felt as rivals to the authors. During Soviet period, unparalleled boom in translation was observed. Majority of such works, in fact, related to social, political, and scientific material. But after the Soviet period, due to abolition of censorship, many texts which were not allowed to be published, these were translated in large quantity. Translation has been the object of scholarly discussion in Russia, in the second half of the 20th century. Theories on translation were written. These theories are largely based on the assumption that translation can be studied and described in an objective and consistent way using various methods of observation, analysis, and in a way it can be said that translation was considered a domain or a science. So it's a combination of art and science. You study it in a systematic manner, in a scientific manner, and what comes out as a final product has a touch of artistic modification or artistic finishing touch. Most of the translation theory writers in Russia are professional translators who help maintain a close link between theory and practice. This is again interesting. If we look at the translations or the translators engaged in translation in other countries, you have different categories of people. There are practicing translators who work on the theory also. Then there are scholarly or academicians or the teachers who may be practicing translation also, but the quantity of translation they carry out or practice as a profession is not as huge as the translators who are working in the market. So the theory is developed by these scholars and the theory is developed by the people who are working in the field are bound to be different, and there have to be some conflict there. In the case of Russia, the case was very clear that the practicing translators were talking or writing about theory as well as practice. Russia always pays attention to the practical training of future translators and interpreters. Well, it has not been written probably in very discreet manner in the documents, but the fact remains that Cold War period or the struggle for the power in the world was partly dominated by Russia, which means that they have to know other languages and they have to have the expertise in English as well. So strategically they laid a great emphasis on publications, translations, and training of translators and interpreters for the future. This was in brief all about the Russian traditions that I had to talk here. So you could probably see the difference between the French traditions and the Russian traditions. Now let's come to the Indian traditions. My Indian audience will relate very easily through the concepts and the phenomenon and the processes that have been talked here. Let's go one by one. India has a long history of translation. All of you would recall various things, for example, Ramayana, Mahabharata, all of these documents and even documents prior to these well-known documents have traveled to various places within India and outside India. Aryans came to India from Central Asia and they settled in Indus area in second millennium BC. They compiled Rig Veda and 3 other Veda in Sanskrit. 2 of the most important source texts for subsequent translation in history included Mahabharata and Ramayana. I think the duration when these were consolidated who came from various parts of the world. It is difficult to say whether they focused primarily on Buddhism only or Buddhist scriptures only, but since so much of literature, so much of classic literature was available already in India, it is obvious that the scholars must have attempted to translate those documents also. Translation activity kept flourishing under the Mughals as Sanskrit manuscripts on Hinduism were translated into Persian and Arabic. This again is interesting. India has been ruled by various people from outside, and most of these people have laid focus on translation for various reasons. One could be that they did not understand the Indian culture, the Indian way of working, and the other is that they found certain things in India that they thought that should be brought back to their countries. Later, when British ruled over India, many English texts, including the Holy Bible, were translated into different Indian languages that included Bengali, Odia, Marathi, Hindi, Assamese, and Sanskrit. Then the classical case of Rabindranath Tagore translating his own work from Bengali to English, which finally wins the Nobel Prize. Certain efforts in creation of institutions where translation activity is being carried out included National Institute of Science, Communication and Information Resources, that is NISCARE, which was originally INSDOC, Indian National Scientific Documentation Center, with a legacy of over 6 decades under the umbrella of CSIR. This organization has been working on translation right from the stage of inception, and various projects including the machine translation project was also initiated at this place. The Center for Applied Linguistics and Translation Studies, CALTS, created as a research center in 1988 at the University of Hyderabad. Then the very popular National Translation Mission. This was set up by Government of India as an initiative to make knowledge text accessible in all Indian languages listed in the 8th schedule of Constitution through translation. In fact, the prime objective of setting up this National Translation Mission was as defined a while ago only, but as a additional benefit from this National Translation Mission, it was targeted to train more and more number of translators who will translate the valuable literature available in various languages into, for example, English or into other Indian languages. If it is translated into other Indian languages, then it becomes accessible to the Indians in other states, and if it is translated into English, then the whole knowledge is available to the world. Probably there was another element of commercial angle also behind the National Translation Mission. It was considered as one of the futuristic industry after the BPOs or the IT. And then let us sum up what we have discussed in this module and also in the previous module. In module 1 we talked about the history of translation, and we also talked about two traditions, Chinese and Japanese traditions. And in this module we have talked about French tradition, Russian tradition and Indian tradition. There have been some similarities between all these traditions, and there were conspicuous differences between all these traditions. They are all attributable to the local needs and the sponsoring agency. Sometimes it was missionary, sometimes it was state. And then the commercial angles also came into the picture. The flow of French tradition indicates very clearly that the focus shifted from religious texts to literature, and maybe from what can be called as quantity to quality in 16th to 17th century. Further, the flow also indicates that translation has been a major activity since the past, and the language experts must study it further so that the history of French tradition and its ramifications over the centuries become clear. About the Russian traditions, it showed that the translation did start with religious texts, but soon it spread to literature and other domains. What is not very clearly defined is probably the strategic areas, which starts with the basic science, that is physics, chemistry, biology, and then it goes into applied, that is engineering, and then further down to nuclear science and the war-related areas. Further, different categories of translators, that is staff, monks, part-time or freelance, it came into existence. The categorization of the translators clearly indicate the vast and diversified needs of the society, and the government were being met by these translators category-wise. As in the case of India, Russia had been a conglomeration of multilingual communities, and translation must have been an obvious option as well as the necessity, though its form and methodology might have been different because it was a very controlled society at that point of time. But prior to what is called as Soviet Union, there were different groups living in different areas, and even if the language was same Russian in one area, there were various dialects which were not so compatible with each other. So this obviously means that there must have been people who were bilingual either as interpreter or as translators. Further, in the USSR days, Soviet Union had been a driving force behind the technology transfer through multilingual means, especially in the Eastern world. In Indian tradition, transculture communication since very long time is obviously attributable to translation also. However, it may not be appropriate to limit the Indian tradition to the age of Ramayana or Rig Veda alone. There is every possibility of multilingual environment persisting much before also. While summing up module 1 together with module 2, you will all realize, or you will all understand, that the pre-war translation efforts are not so well documented. There are some pieces of information available here and there, but it is difficult to link everything, and which in fact might be possible if manpower and efforts are made. Manpower is available and efforts are made. Let us see the second part, that is the war period works. War period works are largely classified even now also. So it is very difficult to find out, and even if one finds out, it will be very difficult to know the complete link among these documents. The post-war period clearly shows that the major momentum in the traditions was on literary as well as commercial areas. It is yet to be established if there was communication among the nations in the past vis-a-vis the translation domain per se. What it means is that translation traditions were persisting in various countries. We have talked about 5 traditions here, and if we see, there are some commonalities and the periods are also overlapping. Now, was there any communication among these nations on these agendas or on these items? It is very difficult to prove at this point of time, because it is also clear that the activity might have progressed in different nations in response to local needs. That means it is just by coincidence that the methodologies or the ways are appearing to be same, but they may not have much to do with each other. French tradition shows the work on theory of translation and standardization, while the Chinese showed the step-by-step approach, that is beginning with word-to-word translation and ending up in the value-added translation. Japanese succeeded very well in manualization of process of translation. Means that for Japanese there was no other alternative but to work upon into Japanese translation, at least in the beginning when the technology was to be brought in from outside. So they did not have what is called as machine or the machine translation. Machine means the machine as a support for the translation, but they tried to use their own abilities or their own capabilities of creating manualized way of doing the things, which they did it very successfully. history of translation will probably remain a myth for the time to come, because there is so much which might have been done by individuals, by sponsored mechanisms, but it is difficult to collate all that information. Mythological documents indicate the use of advanced science and technology. For example, Pushpak Viman, something like a flying object in Ramayana, is an example of airship sailing very smoothly between two nations, and instant rain caused by release of a special purpose arrow. People may not call it by this name, but I am calling it special purpose arrow, could have some nuclear elements in some form attached to this particular arrow. Therefore, it may be difficult to rule out translation in the field of S&T also in ancient times, because single-handed development of science in one country is something which is difficult to perceive. Scope of history, as we have talked earlier also, scope of history of translation is very vast, and many important literary translations cannot be traced. It includes transfer of Ramayana from India to Malaysia, transfer of Buddhist scriptures from India to China, and then to Korea and Japan, and so on. Therefore, only few important milestones of history of translation have been covered in this chapter. Further, state-sponsored translations, especially during the communist regime, also needs to be probed further, because the translators and interpreters in Chinese language who accompany official delegates or official delegations and who are available in Hong Kong, Singapore, Taiwan, USA, etc., clearly indicate that the profession is very well established for a very long time, for quite some time. With this, I would like to close the module 2, of course, together with module 1 on the traditions of translation, by thanking my students Neha Mansharmani, Ashish Kumar and Brijesh Gambhir, who contributed in collection of data and preliminary study for this second module in particular. So thank you very much for being with me, and I would like to move quickly to the practice of translation at the earliest possible. Let's go slowly, but let's go steadily into practice of translation. Thank you very much.